Hi. I don't know if is this working? Is the microphone working? Good. Okay. Yeah. So I fell into open data by accident. I used to be a journalist. I've been interested in computer-aided reporting for probably around about 15 years, since I went to Missouri and met with Elliot Jaspin about 15 years ago, who is in many ways the father of computer-aided reporting. And yeah, so I didn't actually want to open up data. I didn't really have a mission in order to do this sort of stuff. But there wasn't any data. I couldn't get anyone interested in opening up any data, so I went ahead and started writing scrapers and websites to do this. The main focus very much now is open corporates, which is more than a full-time job. I'm the co-founder. Rob is the other co-founder, Rob McKinnon. We have people in the open data community around the world that are helping us do this. And it's quite important, and it's quite big. 40 million companies. Some of our tables have got well over 100 million rows. It starts to get quite chunky. But what I want to talk about today is the issue of company data on a global level, and particularly how it's important and useful for journalists, and to try and get a sense, give you a sense of where we are as as journalists, as the world, and where we need to be. I gave a presentation at NICAR, which is the Computer-Aided Reporting Conference, last month, I think, in St. Louis. And many US business journalists, many UK business journalists, I expect this is true of business journalists around the world, think that the issue of getting information about companies is a solved problem. You know, it's well understood how to do this. I mean, there are all sorts of, LexisNexis is possibly the one that many journalists turn to first. There's things like Hoover's, Jigsaw, Salesforce, various incarnations of Bureau van Dijk, Compass, all of these sorts of things. There's also things like LinkedIn as well, which is an incredibly useful research tool for journalists researching companies. And then there's the sort of, the stuff about about those listed companies, the really big listed companies, and there's information on Google and Yahoo Finance, those sorts of type things. And then, of course, there's the annual report. More specifically, there's the notes to the annual report, because the annual reports are rarely interesting in and of themselves. What's interesting is are those notes to them. Although I started as a journalist, I ran, for the last 15 years, I was running companies, magazine publishing companies. And so you start to get a sense of how business really works. And you know that the only thing that's really important are the notes. And specifically, what you're really looking at is, when you're looking at these things, are the diffs as well. From a coding point of view, what did it say last year about how much was going to be allocated to this? What are the exceptional costs? All those sorts of things. So there's actually a lot out there already. And when we're talking about these huge corporations, that's pretty good for getting an understanding, a picture for where we're up to. But it really only works for these largest companies. The data that they hold on small, medium companies is poor. It's really about the standard sources as well. They only have, when you look at Compass, when you look at the information on Jigsaw, or even LexisNexis, they'll tell you this is the information. But they don't say where the data came from. They don't give any provenance. They don't, and actually, they're usually using one of the same sources, or they are, for example, sending annual reports to the Philippines. Someone like Dun & Bradstreet Experian, people like that, are sending annual reports or images to the Philippines to get rekeyed in, and they get rekeyed in subtly differently and with different errors in there. Outside of the US, the UK, to a certain extent, the major markets, Germany would be one of those, Netherlands, those sorts of things. Once you get out of those, the information rapidly becomes much poorer. Small companies aren't covered well, and you hardly ever get access to the data. So if you want a specific bit of information, that's fine. But if you want to say, okay, give me this data and let me combine it with this other data set, let me put this in my store, you don't get to do that. And the license is restrictive as well, in general. So the problem is that companies don't look like this anymore. They haven't done for some time. They're not even like this, this idea of a huge, great big headquarters and so on. This is what they look like. Now, I did a check of Siemens. I put in Siemens into Open Corporates. There are, I think, 76 Siemens-named companies in Florida alone. Now, I had a look at those, and pretty much all of them are I think there's probably half a dozen which are not related to Siemens. You don't get big companies these days which are a PLC or an SA or an Inc. That's just one part of the network. This is the change of Lehman Brothers over time. From the SEC filings that they made. These are complex networks that are constantly evolving. So we have a situation which is incredibly complex, really difficult to understand. You can still do the investigation. You can still understand it if you know where to start. If you've been told something funny is going on here, if you know that there are issues with you decide that you're going to investigate this person or this company, then you can do digging around and you can potentially find something. But it means that you're reliant upon some great idea, some insight that you just stumbled across, or someone's tipped you off. Some whistleblowers tipped you off. But it doesn't really help with data journalism, and we live in a world of data now. In a world of data, journalism has to be, about data journalism in many ways, because that's where the stories are. We are much of the stories are in plain sight these days, but they're buried in incredibly complex data sets which don't get combined and therefore obscure the stories. There is actually a huge amount of data, public data, that's out there. I mean, we've got, EPA reports, we've got spending reports, we've got European data, we've got European lobbying systems, we've got, there is just vast amounts of data. When I was in the States and talking to some people from the EPA, and they said, "Oh, we've got this data set about ownership and how the companies are related, and we give this to Bloomberg and Dun & Bradstreet. Would you like it?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." And part of me is thinking, God, this data set's going to be quite big, and how are we going to handle this, and what are we going to do? There is so much data out there but it's almost universally. It isn't actually linked to the legal entity. We have things where, they have BP Exploration and Oil Inc. But what does that mean? That's actually just a string of letters in their database. But there are some of this information, it can help us understand the complexity. This is the US, a line from the US, or rather, this is the structure of the US Central Contractor Register, Federal Central Contractor Register. And you can see that there's the cage code, which is the they're sort of a code for suppliers. But there's actually a huge amount of other sorts of data. You know, what do they do? What's their business name? What are they DBA doing business as? What are the addresses? When did the business start? Fiscal year end? Corporate URLs? Organization type? Telephone numbers? Websites? Email addresses? Names of people? This is actually quite a big file, and this is really important because many companies don't disclose this information. So if we can tie this all together, then even those companies that are quite secretive become a little bit more understandable. And I just want to mention about legal entities. When people think of a huge company, whether it's Microsoft or Siemens or Barclays Bank or whatever, they think of this thing. But actually, it's only a thing in terms of the Borg is a thing. You know, it's actually a group of multiple legal entities, and legal entity matters. These are because a company is essentially a construct that is formed by the state and given legal personality. You know, you can't imprison a company. It is something that and it is something that has to obey the laws. That is, that can end up in court. But it's also the thing that by having these legal entities, you end up with companies that have multiple legal entities. When you have hundreds of legal entities, it's because that's the structure that works for that company. You know, when Shell has a company in the British Virgin Islands, for example, and the British Virgin Islands is one of the most secret jurisdictions there is. You can only get information about companies by faxing them and doing a bank transfer and specifically asking for exactly what you want from them. Why do they have a company in the British Virgin Islands? It's not because there's actually untapped oil reserves there. It's not because there's a huge population which is going to be a great market for them. It's not because there's an extremely well educated population who are all experts in oil exploration or any other field that Shell's interested in. It's because that legal entity gives them some advantages. Usually it's a conduit, it's a firewall essentially. It says that the information that goes from this thing, the British Virgin Islands company will probably own another company. But that's a firewall. You can't see how this other company belongs to the Shell network because of this firewall. Similarly, there are firewalls for tax to ensure that the profits end up only in those places where there is very little tax. It's a little bit like in the movies where they're trying to track a hacker, and there'll be some map of the world, and they'll think, and it'll be like, oh, he's just appeared on a node. He's connecting through a node in Azerbaijan, which is going through, being fed from the UK, which in turn is being fed from Pakistan. Which they're trying to track down the trackers. This is sort of what it works with companies. The money flows from one to another to another to another, dependent on the taxation agreements, dependent on the regulation agreements, and so on. So these are incredibly complex networks, and in order to understand them, we really need to have a pretty good picture of the whole thing. We have this regulatory arbitrage where companies will say, I'm going to be forming here. If you don't change your regulations, then I won't be in the UK or Germany or the Netherlands and so on. So they sort of barter off the jurisdictions between them. And it matters, this stuff. It matters from a point of view of doing good journalism. It matters from a point of view of the society that we're living in. The financial crisis, in some ways, was about opacity, about what's going on here. So open corporates. I set up open corporates with co-founder Rob about just over a year and a quarter ago. We started with three countries, the UK, Jersey, and Bermuda. We've now got 52, I think. Barbados is the 52nd. Mauritius is the 51st. Just over 40 million companies. This screenshot's out of date. The goal was to do a really simple thing, which is just have an entry, specifically have a URL, so that people could use that as an identifier for every corporate legal entity in the world. Because unless you can have points that you can tie this stuff together, you're nowhere. Unless you can say, whether it's, Greenpeace can say, oh, when I'm talking about this company, then I'm talking about this specific company with this ID, and they can exchange information with Friends of the Earth, where newspapers can use company identifiers to know that they're, to understand it, to understand their own data, where regulators can understand this. So we came up with this idea that we would just wanted an entry, a simple thing of an entry for every single company in the world, based on the jurisdiction and on the company number that was issued by that jurisdiction. This is a really brief digression. The best hackers in the world are corporate lawyers. The most successful hackers in the world are corporate lawyers. They have huge amounts of resources. They operate entirely within the law. But they're hackers in the sense that hackers are people who take a set of rules and then make those rules work for different purposes than they were intended. And they are enormously good at whenever a new tax code comes out, whenever new rules about big business come out, they're incredibly good at doing it. And one of the things that enables them to do this is, and this is things like the Duns number. The Duns number was a fantastic business idea. Dun & Bradstreet, which is probably the biggest database of company information in the world, came up with the idea 50 years ago. And they had the idea of, let's create an ID system that we get to own these IDs for these companies. In the US, this ID system is the primary ID system that's used. Even if you'll often see DUNS numbers related to in US stuff, even in the UK to a degree, and they're trying to get it in use in all sorts of different areas. So, for example, in that central contractor register I showed, one of the fields they don't show is the DUNS number, because it's proprietary. But there's another document somewhere where they say, this is a cage number, this is the number for in the register, but this isn't the primary ID, we actually use the DUNS number as the primary ID. And so what happens is that you persuade companies to use this number, and then the only way they can get the only way that governments, anyone else, can get information is going via Dun & Bradstreet. And so they end up buying their own data via Dun & Bradstreet. And that just kind of, and then they assert the IP so that no one can really reuse this. It's nothing to do with journalism, other than it kind of shows the world that we're dealing with. So along with those basic IDs that we've been doing, and the fact that company exists and it's got this company number, we've been pulling in data. We pull in, for example, London, the Gazette notices, which are the UK official journals. We pull in the SEC register entries. We get addresses from that. We pull in world trademark data. We're going to be pulling in EPA data. We may do the European Patent Office stuff as well. We're just talking with them about it. We're pulling in spending data from the UK government. We've got the EU lobbying that's registered, that's ready to come in. And everything is under an open database, share-alike attribution license. So how does this help journalists? There are 4 ways that we've we've been talking with journalists, we've been working with journalists for some time now. There are four key ways that this is useful. First of all, I really wouldn't underestimate the simple search. When you search for a company, journalists are time constrained. There are very few journalists in the world these days who can basically say, oh, look, I think I'll just spend the next 4 weeks doing something. And when you can reduce one of those elements of the job down from being 2 hours to being 2 minutes, then that gives you an awful lot more time to do the difficult stuff. And so just to be able to search for companies in a whole bundle of different territories makes a difference. And for some people who are researching global companies or American companies, because it's very difficult with American companies because each state uses its own company, it generates its own companies and has stuff. What if questions? Wait a minute. So what if name across all these things? What if I change it from being this to that? What if I look at alternative spellings? What if I look at things elided together? Let me just have a look at these sorts of things. Now, if you've got to search individually over 50, 60, 70 jurisdictions, those sorts of what-if questions are just unfeasible because they take a huge amount of work. This was a Danish story the Danish journalist did, and he basically put in the top 100 companies into open corporates, Danish companies into open corporates, and found which of them had companies in tax havens. And then he rang them up and said, why have you got companies in tax havens? And most of them said, well, how did you get this information? How did you know about it? One of them said, no, we haven't. That's not our company. And he said, well, it's there in the register. And they said, well, it's nothing to do with us, but thanks for telling us. Now, that could easily be something to do with passing off and pretending that they're a company, some fraudulent thing. Source for additional information. We're increasingly pulling in websites, filings, what the status is. It's got things like the previous names as well. So when you do in open corporates, we search for the previous names, which again is useful. It also allows some kind of interesting searches where, for example, if you discovered that a big corporation initially has all of their companies called, Shelfco 456 or something like that, then you can search for things like, you can search for that. It's actually quite interesting if you put Shelfco into open corporates, the number of entries that you get. Again, with trademarks, spending data, all that sort of stuff, we've got some of that. And again, we can pull in that sort of things. It gives you links into other sources of information. For example, the SEC data, there's a lot of data there. And again, to know that this German company, this French company, even though we might not have the German register yet, they'll still be registered with the SEC. It'll probably be a US branch that we registered with it, so you can find information about the home company. We're looking at importing lobbying registers in the next few months as well. Reconciliation. There's a tool called Google Refine, which every data journalist should be familiar with because it's incredibly useful. And what reconciliation is, I mean, Google Refine is not just for this. It's about cleaning up data. It's about matching data together, about taking messy data and making sense of it. But one of the features it's got is reconciliation or matching names to things. Now, those may be US states. They may be German towns. They may be politicians. But we offer an API which ties in with this so that you can match names of companies to the legal entities. And that's really good in terms of So, for example, we're talking to the European Patent Office, and the European Patent Office have a whole bunch of different company names, and they're trying to work out which of those are the same. Now, it's very difficult to know whether Microsoft UK Limited is the same as Microsoft Limited in the UK, is the same as Microsoft brackets UK Limited, because you don't know which of those is the correct one. So it makes a lot more sense to tie them to the actual legal entity, and then you can have a much better match of understanding of tying those bits of data together. So you can do this on open corporates. Open spending use this in order to match the spending data to use this service for spending data to recipients. We're doing a story together with the Telegraph at the moment about political donations in the UK by companies to parties based on that. The third thing is the database, the platform. And the API allows people to tie into the data at quite a deep level. And basically anything you can do on the website, you can do via the API. And so you can tie programs together, you can build you can build it into mashups or other websites or as widgets. But because it's an API and because it's a platform, it also allows people to start adding data themselves. We're still at a fairly early stage here, but you can see this is the sort of thing that happens. Someone who's registered with Twitter with us has added information about this company. And this is a thing we have called corporate groupings, which allow you to essentially map together legal entities with what we as humans think of as a company. So Maersk is a Danish shipping company, I think, and this guy has mapped together 205 companies around the world to do with this. And because of that, then you can just subscribe to the RSS feed, and whenever we have a new bit of data about any of these companies, then he'll get alerted by this. There's data that we've got. For example, this International Training Service, ITS Limited, is an official government UK supplier, but we haven't actually matched that to a company because there is no ITS or International Training Services Limited that's ever been incorporated in the UK. And we've got all 7.5 million companies that have been incorporated at any time in the last, I think it's about 30 or 40 years in there. So this has never existed, but we're just testing something at the moment where it allows people the crowd to clean up this data. And we've just started indexing company officers, mostly directors, but also things like chief financial officers as well. At the moment, we've got this for, I think, around 10 jurisdictions, and mostly in the US. New Zealand is going to come on stream sometime in the next month or so. Canada's on there as well. Again, this is a little bit more. You think, okay, this is kind of nice and kind of useful, but it's actually a bit more than this. And by putting it all together in one place, you start to get some really, from a journalistic point of view, some good options, some good routes. So you type in Romney. I mean, you can type in Mitt Romney, but also maybe you type in Romney because you want to know, potentially family members that are doing it. But if you typed in Mitt Romney, you actually get 7 companies at the moment. And you see that he was director of, I don't think I've got it on this, no, I haven't got it on this slide, but he's a director of 7 different companies in the US, or has been, that we know of. One of those is a company called Healthcare Acquisition, Inc., which was incorporated in 1989 in Mississippi. Now, actually, it's a Delaware company, but because it was doing business in Mississippi, it needed to register as a branch in Mississippi. Now, the thing about Delaware companies is people register for a lot of reasons. There's tax reasons, there's law reasons, but there's also secrecy reasons. And Delaware and Nevada in particular both make a point of that they don't collect this information about owners of companies, about directors, and but when they register in Mississippi, they have to make this information public. So we know that he was director of a Delaware company. Even though we don't have that Delaware company, we know that he was the director of a Delaware company, and actually we know what the address is that he gave at that point for this company between 89 and 91. Now, you know, I did this in this whole process took about 2 minutes. You put in Mitt Romney, you see that he's registered with this company, a director of this company. You then get the address, you click through to the company register, you get the address, you then put the address into Google, and you see what comes up with. Now, there's almost nothing there. The first thing that's interesting is that it was a residence. Now, even in 89, 90, most people of that type working for finance companies, venture capital, whatever, wouldn't put a residential address in there, so that in itself was kind of interesting. Normally they'd put in a lawyer's address or the headquarters of the company. But he put in this residential address. Now I couldn't find, there was about 10 Google entries about this when you search in Google, and one of them was a donation by somebody entirely different for $500 to a campaign contribution. Now, my guess is that there's no story there at all. But that process took 2 minutes to discover that he was potentially connected with somebody else who'd made a campaign contribution. You also get to see who the other directors are. You see those connections between those other people back in 1989 to 91. And I think that shows the potential power of where we're going with this. You know, you can see that we don't just show you the director, we show you the other people that have got the same or similar names to it. So for example, we ignore initials, for example, or we ignore Mr., Mrs., you know, Junior, and all these sorts of things. So similar sorts of names with it. We'll probably extend that to being, okay, and here are the companies, so here are the companies and the other names associated with those other companies, so you get to basically see several other links in the chain of the network. Oh yeah, here's Mitt Romney. So healthcare acquisition. Now the other thing is that you get to see Boltco one's vaguely interesting as well. I mean, there's obvious things in terms of 89 to 94, maybe people have forgotten that he was involved in this thing called Boltco, which is actually something to do with buying something in Baltimore, something to do with the Baltimore, some infrastructure in Baltimore from the Baltimore state. And you can just do that thing of, okay, let me put Boltco Inc. and problem, or Boltco Inc. and scandal into Google. And do, you know, and that takes no time at all. And suddenly you've got potential route for doing some interesting investigation. And at the moment we're linking to Google and Little Sis, but we're talking with Influence Explorer about linking to them as well. And so ideally what we'd be doing is pulling in using their API so that you could actually see that information all on the same page. So that's sort of where we're up to with Open Corporates, and that's already, I think, is already, as someone who used to be a journalist, already quite useful. But I would say we're probably around where OpenStreetMap was about 3 years ago. In terms of, for some things, it's useful, but there's still a long way to go. By a long way, it's the biggest open database of companies in the world. But there's really some significant countries and jurisdictions we haven't matched, including Germany. We've actually got Germany. Someone scraped German register and has given it to us. We haven't imported it for 2 reasons. One is we're still figuring out exactly how to represent it, because there's this strange thing with courts and so on. And 2 is we'd rather be getting it from the German government than scraping it. We're talking with a number of European governments already about them giving their data to us. And increasingly we're finding that the governments are being quite supportive of this. some are not. But I think we'll end up with this thing where these countries are going to be open, and these ones are going to be closed. And we're working with the EU. Amazingly, we're the only sort of independent voice on the Financial Stability Board, which is a G20 organisation that's supposed to stop the next financial crisis, on their work on legal entity identifiers. And but nevertheless, some company registers. I mean, company registers were one of the earliest forms of public registers there were. You know, there's this trade-off between, okay, we as a state will agree to form your company, give it legal personality. It used to be an act of parliament, or some law would have to be passed in order to do it. But we will create this. We will even give you, as the owners of the company, special protection, so that if the company goes down, you don't suffer. The people who suffer are the customers or the suppliers, and society, and the employees, and society at large. But somewhere along the line, these company registers thought they were running businesses themselves, and that the data was there to be sold, rather than actually being official registers. So we've got to disabuse them of that, we being society, because if we can't keep track of companies, then essentially we're fucked as a society. European countries are some of the worst. For example, Greece. You don't even get to search for whether a Greek company exists. There's no way of finding out whether a Greek company exists, never mind getting its director's information and its filings and so on. Panama is better than Greece, you know. The Isle of Man is better than Greece. Jersey is better than... They're all better than Greece. You know, Spain is just as bad. Germany is not great. They got these horrid deals with private companies who possibly own it, have some ownership, and it's all very vague. So we've got some work to do, particularly in Europe. And then the final thing is like, this is again, like OpenStreetMap or Wikipedia, this is an open database. That's really good for journalists, because we say where we got the information from. And sometimes the information is wrong. But it's nearly always wrong. And all our experience so far, it may be sometimes we match it incorrectly. We say that we think this company is related to this bit of data, and we get it wrong. That does happen and can happen. Virtually all the occasions where the data has been wrong have been occasions where it's been wrong on the official source. And that allows you to start fixing that. Oh, you know, someone says, I didn't realize I was putting my home address in there. Or I've got this health and safety violation and I didn't realize, you know, and it's not me. And it turns out that it was a mistake with the health and safety executive in the UK. And having that provenance, being able to go back to that source, is really important, I think, increasingly for journalism, but increasingly for data as a whole. Most people reckon that Thomas Jefferson didn't say this now, that it was probably Ralph Nader. Even that is disputed. But I think actually Thomas Jefferson would have said this if he was alive and around today. Thank you.